Good evening, group. Welcome back. I'm always glad when the students show back up. Let me start off this evening with a few comments in relation to the work that we've been doing so far and some of the things that you may be finding or some things that may be helpful to you as you continue to learn more about research. I can recommend strongly a TED Talk to you by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. He's actually a biologist by training and trade from the United Kingdom. And the TED Talk is titled The Science Delusion. But he's also written a book, and in the United States, the book is marketed under the title Science Set Free. And in both the TED Talk, it's in sort of accelerated version. And for those of you that prefer to read, it is a little longer narrative, of course. But what Dr. Sheldrake does is he lays out 10 dogmas of science that he believes should be challenged. And the reason I mention that to you is I think it'll be helpful to you. I know you're swamped because you have full-time jobs and families and graduate school. But what Dr. Sheldrake does is give a pretty good and compelling argument that as practitioners and as researchers, I know most of us are in the practitioner world, myself included, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to be pretty astute consumers of research and critical reviewers of research. And Dr. Sheldrake makes some pretty interesting and compelling arguments about why we should be skeptical, and that really that's sort of an underlying premise behind research. The scientific method is an inquiry-based approach, always centered around a question. The tougher the question, the tighter the question, the more intense and focused the research can be and should be. And we talked about that last week a little bit. If you aim small, you miss small. And we're going to talk about some of the nuances of research, or I will have a few comments for you, not really a lecture, about some of the nuances of research this week. And I think just from reading the submissions that you've been making in your feedback documents to me, I think you're becoming much more astute observers and readers of the research and have a much keener eye for what you're looking for. And particularly, I'm hoping that the process is making you more comfortable in finding what it is you're looking for. If nothing else, I suspect that most of you, unless you've already been through a tools course, let me back up and qualify that. In the world of academia, we call courses like this one a tools course. For those of you that choose to pursue a doctorate, you've got several more hours of this in front of you. You'll have at least one entire course in qualitative research and at least one entire course centered around nothing but quantitative research. Probably more than that. Most universities will require of you 12 hours of tools. But this is sort of the stick your toe in the water version of research. But at its base, research is centered on inquiry, critical inquiry. And we should approach the studies that we want to embark on very skeptically and very critically. And we should also read the research and studies of others with a very skeptical and critical eye. One of the things that you've noticed, and I've been asking you for every week, is the limitations. And in some documents you'll see it shown as delimitations. But basically, what the limitations are is the researcher's opportunity to steal your thunder. It's the opportunity of the researcher to say, this is the question I use, this is the way I chose to study it. But oh yeah, I understand. This could be a weakness in that study. You could poke a hole in it here. Here's where some challenges were that didn't allow us to get the data we were actually completely looking for. So the researcher has the opportunity to lay out for you ahead of time where they think the flaws may be. And if you read a study and there really aren't very many limitations in there, or none, that should raise your level of skepticism, either that the researcher was not very intentional in their approach, or perhaps that they may be trying to hide something from you. I think many of you have seen in the studies that you've looked at so far a pretty frequent listing of a limitation is they use the word generalizability. This doesn't generalize beyond this campus. This doesn't generalize beyond middle schools, because they did it in middle schools. They're telling you you can't take their data and their conclusions and say, okay, that works for high schools as well. Their limitations will say it's not generalizable beyond the state of Louisiana or beyond the state of Missouri or Ohio, as they say it. And it's just basically the researcher putting qualifiers on their findings. But it's them telling you as a consumer of the research, we know what you're thinking, we know you're skeptical, we know you're reading critically, so we're going to steal your thunder. We're going to tell you where we think the flaws are ahead of time. Something else that I suspect that you've been finding when you read through studies is, I like to call it mushy madness. And when you've articulated the conclusions for me in some of the studies that you've been reading, I see the mushy madness there. And a lot of times this happens when researchers conceive of a study, they carry it out, and the conclusions are just not very definitive. And this is particularly so, not exclusively, but particularly so in the qualitative research. And so what the researchers will do when they report their conclusions is they'll string together a whole bunch of words with multiple syllables, and some of them you'll have to use the dictionary to look up. And after you do look it up, you will have read through a sentence of about 30 words with lots of commas and colons and semicolons, and you still won't know what they said. And so the researchers are, when they do that to you, they're basically saying, you know, we spent all this time and effort on a study, and we don't know what the hell we found out. And it's common. It's not uncommon. One of the most powerful things about research is if you approach it with integrity and fidelity, you're asking a pretty hard question on the front end, not an easy question to answer. Because if it was an easy question, there'd be tons of research on already, and the conclusions would already be in. So you're asking difficult questions, and you're trying to figure out ways to collect data that will inform you and enlighten all of us in that regard. But if the conclusions are not clear, then just say it. And a lot of researchers don't want to do that. They're afraid to do that. So they end up hiding it, cloaking it in a whole lot of fancy words that is really hard for you to discern the meaning. Sometimes that happens when they discover that their study had some weak research questions to start with. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Quite often you see that, and again, this is a qualitative problem more than a quantitative problem, is when they've chosen extremely small sample sizes. Of course, the classic version of that is a case study, in which basically you're studying one organization or one individual. But that's a limitation on the front end, because you're really, if I'm studying, for instance, Nelson Mandela and Nelson Mandela only, then I have to come right out and say, I don't think my conclusions about this man are generalizable across the population. Some other things that you're coming across too. By the way, if you have not read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk Home, it's great. It's a fabulous work. I recommend it for anybody. Another thing, a nuance of research that I wanted to visit with you a little bit about tonight is this. And I've seen this in some of your submissions. I call it tool marketing. You'll have particularly a group of professors, and usually it's tenure track professors in one university or another. They decide a question that they want to study, and they decide, hey, we'll come up with this really good survey or instrument by which we can measure leadership abilities, or we can measure efficacy of reading programs, and they'll hang a fancy name on that tool. And so they'll say, we conducted this research with 350 third grade students, and we use such and such tool, and it'll be in quotation marks usually. It'll be a highfalutin word. At the bottom of the line, bottom line is they created this tool to sell. And so they're conducting research with their instrument in the interest of trying to market that thing down the road, either to state education associations or other universities that may be interested in doing studies in the particular genre that they're working in. But professors are quite often involved in trying to create cottage industries for themselves, so they have some passive income other than their teaching gig. And so you can usually recognize that when you see it. But just be aware, a lot of times when you see fancy sounding names for instruments that they're using to measure data of some kind or another, quite often they've created that thing for the purpose of selling it down the road. Meta-analyses. A few of you have come across meta-analyses, and I love those. They're great because what happens in a meta-analysis is the researcher or the research team, rather than trying to conduct a study of their own, what they do is they examine a whole pile of research that's already been done on that topic. For instance, if you were looking at math interventions for algebra students, a team of researchers might say, what are the most efficacious interventions to improve performance of students in Algebra 1? And they will read hundreds, sometimes even thousands of studies that have been done on that very topic in some form or another in years previous. And then they will, what they'll do is try to quantify what they've found in that and categorize it and sort it and sift it and look for trends, and then come up with some conclusions that they can say, you know, we looked at 350 studies on algebra interventions, and we believe these are the top 4 strategies that we found through all that analysis. And so that is a meta-analysis study, and those are very powerful studies if they're done with some fidelity. And I love reading those because really it means someone else has dug through all the research for me ahead of time, and I get to read their executive summary of what they've learned. So those are powerful studies. Let's talk about research questions for just a moment, and I promise I'll give you all the floor to ask me questions here in a little bit. But I asked you in our forum, I believe it was in week 3, I think, to identify what at that time you thought were probably the 2 questions that were of most interest to you if you were to launch a study of your own and thinking ahead to your final exam and having to tell me what you might include in a research proposal. So you all fired a couple of questions at me. And I saw varying degrees of robustness in those questions. But I thought I might talk you through a little bit of the thinking that goes into this, because when and if you ever actually launch a study, if you choose a master's degree in some other program that requires a master's thesis, or if you choose to chase a doctorate, or if you choose to tackle some action research on your own campus or in your own workplace at some point in time, the power of the question always drives the quality of the conclusions of the study. You got all that other stuff to deal with, the instruments for data collection, the sample sizes, the way you go about the samples, all that stuff is important. But at the end of the day, the quality and the power of the question drives the quality of the conclusions that you can reach from the study. And so what I'm going to do right now is kind of walk you through a series of questions that could be used for a study, but they get increasingly tighter as I go. And I'll try to do this in a way that makes some kind of sense for you. So for instance, Standard 2 in the ELCC standards has to do with student achievement, and rightly many studies are undertaken in the interest of trying to figure out what works to improve student achievement. So a person could use a research question that sounds like this: how might we improve student achievement? Well, that's a nice question. It's extremely broad because based on just intuition and what you and I already know from the field. Student achievement could be improved by more time on task. Student achievement could be improved by higher quality instruction. Student achievement could be improved by more sleep at night. Student achievement could be improved by higher and better nutrition, both at home and at school. There are a whole host of things that could improve student achievement. So if we were to choose how might we improve student achievement as a research question, that is way too broad, and we could never come up with an instrument that would give us any kind of real informative data so we could come with some sound conclusions. So let's tighten that question up one level. By the way, I didn't even ask. Can you all hear me okay? You're all acting like you hear me, or you're acting like dinner tastes pretty good. I don't know which. But so let's tighten that question up one level, and I think you'll see. So I'll move from the question, how might we improve student achievement? So let's tighten it up just a little bit, and we'll say, what teaching strategies lead to student achievement? So now, when you change the question to that, then you eliminate the stuff about nutrition, you eliminate the stuff about rest, you eliminate the stuff about some sort of software. You're basically asking a fairly broad question, but it's certainly tighter than the original one. You're shrinking your search for improved student achievement to teaching strategies. Still pretty broad, and it would be a very difficult study to undertake unless you were going to just do a very small qualitative study in a single campus. And maybe try to come to some conclusions, but it would be very hard to come up with any real tight conclusions because that question too is a little too broad. So let me tighten that question up just a little more. What if we were to change the question, what teaching strategies lead to student achievement, to what is the impact of block scheduling on student achievement? So now that shrinks the field a little more. You get a little tighter. And you're taking a lot more, as my dissertation chair used to describe it when I was working on my dissertation at Texas Tech. He used to say there are many confounding and mediating variables. Yes, there always are, no matter how tight you get your study. But the broader your question, the more confounding and mediating variables you introduce into it. Because even the fact that you decided just to study how block scheduling might impact student achievement, then you have to have some frame of reference of, okay, if block scheduling is it, how do I know that it's the block scheduling that's actually having the impact? So you almost have to study a 7-period schedule or an accelerated block schedule or a flex block schedule. And so you still have this large area of ambiguity and grayness that gets introduced into your conclusions, where it's very hard for you to just say, we absolutely have the data to prove that block scheduling either does improve student achievement or does not. And by the way, there's tons of research on block scheduling. So I've been a principal in schools that have been in block schedules. I've been a principal in one that's adopted block schedules. I've been a principal in ones that abandoned block schedules. Let me stop right here and insert Nelson's opinion on you. You can take this or leave it, and you'll probably hear it again in a later course if they don't fire me or before you take me again. The most fundamental and pivotal variable in whether students learn is the teacher. It's the teacher. A high-quality teacher will work in a block schedule and make learning happen. A high-quality teacher can work in a 7-period schedule and make learning happen. A high quality teacher can work in a flex block schedule, an accelerated schedule, an online schedule. They can work in any kind of environment and they can cause learning to happen. An unskillful teacher can fail to make learning happen regardless of the structure of the schedule. And so at the end of the day, if you're pursuing principal work or superintendent work, I think most of you probably are, your house is built on the quality of the professionals that are teaching the students in the classroom every day. And that's not to discredit or discount all the other factors that go into it. But at the end of the day, our job is to cause learning to happen for students, and that happens fundamentally, most fundamentally, in the classroom and on the shoulders of a high-quality teacher. Back to the scheduling, back to the research questions. So let's move a little tighter, just a little tighter, from the question that I did have for you. What is the impact of block scheduling on student achievement? We're still talking student achievement. Let's tighten it up just a touch more. Let's take that question to a different level. How do cooperative learning groups impact student achievement? So now we've shrunk down not just teaching strategies or the structural pieces of how the schedule is built, but we've centered on one particular teaching strategy and its impact on student achievement. So then we could craft some surveys or some interviews, some structured interviews, some unstructured interviews. We could take a look at student performance data, pre and post. We could do quant, we could do qual, we could do mix, but there's a lot of things we could do. But when we tighten it down to one particular teaching strategy and its impact on student achievement, then we have a much tighter research question, and we have the prospect of having a much tighter set of conclusions at the end of the study. Let's tighten it down just a little more. What if instead of that research question, we use this one? How do cooperative learning groups impact student achievement in core curricula? Now, we jumped a little bit tighter. Now we're ruling out all the electives, all the career and technology stuff. We're just basically saying, what does cooperative learning do for student achievement within a fairly narrow band of coursework? That's still pretty broad, because you're still talking about math, science, English, and social studies, which those are generally pretty, the social studies and the English language arts are pretty textual and narrative driven, and the sciences and the mathematics are pretty process driven. So they're different kind of creatures. So we still would have some difficulty getting a real tight set of data that we believe would generalize to a broader population. So let's we go just with a little bit tighter question. How do cooperative learning groups impact student achievement of middle school students in core curricula? So now we've shrunk it down to a specific band of courses and a specific teaching strategy and a narrow set of students for a possible sample population. Stand a little better chance of coming up with some data that might lead us to some conclusions that could be generalizable or at least informative to the larger knowledge base. Let's tighten it up just a touch more. Let me scroll down here on my cheat sheet. How do cooperative learning groups impact student achievement in the core curricula of 7th grade students? A little bit tighter. What we did is we kept the teaching strategy and the student achievement as a focus, but we shrunk the population that we would be studying. And so when we come up with conclusions from that, however we crafted the tools or the instruments that we were using to collect the data, then when we come to conclusions, we're coming to conclusions for a tighter set of students that are a little more homogeneous in their form. There's a lot of difference in a 7th grade student and a 10th grade student and a 4th grade student. Developmentally, cognitively, and along a lot of other dimensions as well. Let's tighten it up a little tighter. I promise not to talk to you all night about this stuff. How do cooperative learning groups impact student achievement in mathematics for 7th grade students? So now with tightening the research question up from core curricula, we tighten it down to a specific discipline, which makes it a little easier to collect high quality data. And what we do is we eliminate a fairly large number of mediating and confounding variables. Let's tighten it up just a little more. How do cooperative learning groups impact student achievement in mathematics for 7th graders who have not had a grade above B in grades 5 and 6? So now we've shrunk from all 7th graders to those who have at least a 2-year window of time in which they've not seemed to perform at the top of the game in relation to their cohort in the study of mathematics. So that gives us a better chance of coming up with some data to say, you know, we took this group of kids that maybe not have struggled with mathematics for the 2 previous years, but they have not been knocking it out of the park, and we applied very intentionally and specifically and intensely this concept of cooperative learning groups in this particular discipline, and now we're measuring pre and post to see what the effects are if we can find any effects. So that's a much tighter research question, and it's a much easier question for you to design the kinds of instruments and tools that you think you want to use in measuring the efficacy of that treatment. That's medical terms. In the medical profession, they call it treatments. But you get the idea. I'm going to quit beating that horse and move on to another one here. And I trust you all will be gathering some questions that come to mind as we go. But I think you may have already come to the conclusion when you're thinking about research questions for a study proposal. You don't want to ask a question that can be answered with a yes or a no. That is not informative at all to us. If you say, do cooperative learning groups impact student achievement? You collect a bunch of data and you look at it and you go, yeah, we think so. It doesn't tell you anything about the efficacy of the treatment. It doesn't tell you anything about how it was applied. It doesn't tell you anything about your conclusions as to why you think it might have worked. It's just a yes-no question. And so you want to avoid those when you're thinking about research questions. As a future or present school leader, here we go again, Nelson imposing his opinion on you, but your use of questions, you as a school leader, you have a tremendous array of communication tools at your disposal. I believe the 2 most important ones in this order are 1, listening, and 2, the ability to ask good questions. So as you think about moving to leadership roles or ever higher leadership roles, polish your skills, your listening skills, and there's tons of work, or there's tons of research, and there are tons of good books, and I can recommend many of them to you because the concept of both being a better listener and a better questioner, I've had on my own personal growth plan for numerous years over the past 12, 14 years. I'm moving on to the next topic. I think some of you have already figured out, it seems like you've kind of caught on to the drill as far as the way this course is structured and the way you're expected to submit your work and the way you're expected to approach your work. If you were applying with me, either if I were the campus principal or if I were a district superintendent and you were applying with me as an assistant principal or for a principal position, or even if you were applying for me for a teaching position, one of the questions that you would face without doubt, is what are some of your most strongly held beliefs about teaching and learning? And tell me how you came to that conclusion. And the reason I say that to you tonight is for this purpose. When I'm trying to envision learning tasks that will move the needle for you cognitively and intellectually, and from a professional knowledge perspective. I'm always doing it with the idea of giving you, and this is one of my most strongly held beliefs about teaching and learning, that learning occurs best when the student or the learner has some variety and choice in the way they go about the learning. And so that's one of the reasons that every week I open the world up to you. I will narrow down the list of topics as they align to those standards. But then the world is your oyster when you start chasing the research. Because if it's for instance, on the topic of student achievement, you can look at student achievement through mathematic interventions. You can look at student achievement through the way master schedules are built. You can look at student achievement through the way bus routes are unloaded. You can look at student achievement in relation to the time of day that elementary schools start versus middle school start versus high school start. There's tons of ways that you have some variety and choice in the way you want to chase that stuff. And that's very intentional on my part. But I'm also trying to model that for you as you think ever more about becoming primarily a teacher of adults instead of just a teacher of children as you move upward and onward on the leadership ramp. Let me make a comment about our collective intelligence repositories that I share back with you. And I'll remind you of this again later, probably week 7. But I do that for you as well, both as a service and as a learning prompt. I'm married to one of the smartest people that I know. And I've tried for years to get her to become a school administrator, and she wouldn't. I'm the one that ended up spending all the money on graduate hours when she should have been the one with a doctor in front of her name and doing what I'm doing with you tonight. But if my lovely bride, Mo, were sitting in a traditional graduate class, she would be the one that sits in the back of the room and would try to get through the class every time without saying a word. Yet she might be the smartest person in the room. So when I force all of you to put your thinking into words and then I share it back to you, what I'm trying to do is one, I'm trying to tease out the best thinking of every one of you, and then I'm giving all of us the benefit of seeing the thinking of all of us, because collectively we are smarter than any one of us could possibly be. One thing for your consideration, and I'll mention this to you again in week 7, because I do this on purpose as well. Some of you are going to graduate in December, but many of you are still on the journey, and you have other courses in front of you. Some of you will most likely pursue doctorates down the way. And so at the end of the day, what you have now, when I give you all that collective research that 38 of you have been looking through, you all now have it in a nice, very tight package that you can download and save somewhere and get back to it very quickly. And if you have particular classmates that you deem to be someone of a similar interest as far as fields of study, then you can collaborate with them. You can see what they read. You can see the trails that they chased down when they were looking for research. As well, you'll have a whole set of nice quality studies that someone has read through and given you the appropriate, we're getting there. We're not there yet. We're still working on appropriate APA citations. But they'll given you the appropriate APA citations and a nice little summary of the conclusions of the study, which gives you a nice body of research that you can quickly reference when you're doing literature reviews, either when you're writing for an article in one of your professional journals or working on a master's thesis or working on a doctorate at some point in time later down the way. Let me see now. I think that's all the stuff that I intended for me to blather about, and already I've run longer than I have in the previous 3 weeks. Some of it, I'm probably ruining your dinner. You're probably expecting to be done at 6:30. And if you need to go, that's fine. let me shut up. And Andy, this week I did remember to turn on the recording, and I have the chat box open. So you may or may not have figured it out. I don't hear as well as I should. My wife has told me for years that I needed to get hearing aids, and for most of those years I was a high school principal, and I said, hell no, I don't need to hear everything that's going on in that building anyway. So, but I still haven't gotten hearing aids. So your questions, if you put them in the chat box, there's a better chance of me not asking you to have to repeat them. But ask me questions about our practice, about problems of practice, about school leadership in general, about graduate research. Fire at me if you got them. Who is that that's exercising while you're going to class? Is that Carla? Randy?
I'm on my way to a football game. I'm
It's
on my way to a football game.
It's called personal development on 2 different dimensions at the same time.
Flag football.
This is called wait time in instructional pedagogy. Danielle, our research question, are we right or wrong with our question? I don't like to frame it that way. I would prefer to take a look at the questions and say, I think this is a pretty tight question that you stand a pretty good chance of getting some good tight data in answering, or and I'm not trying to dodge your question at all. Or on the other side of that is, I think this question's too broad. Maybe a better way, Danielle, is if you'll fire the question at me either on the message board or by email, I'll just respond to you and I'll tell you if I think it's a good, strong question or if I think it can be tightened up and some possible solutions for that. The thing about the tight questions is really if you get a good, strong question that'll actually provide some information that informs the profession, and it's nice and tight, then it makes your life as a researcher a little bit easier, because the tools and the instruments that you use to try to collect the data to answer the question can be reduced and much narrower in scope. And if you can get data that you think leads to some sort of conclusion, then it's a much firmer ground that you can stand on when you're declaring to your colleagues who are also critical readers of research. You can say, here's the conclusion I came to, here's the data we collected, and here's why we think this is the conclusion, and it's actionable. If you got a nice tight question and you got strong instruments, then it's easier for you to win those arguments with your colleagues. And there's always going to be, we all need to be skeptics, but there's always the uber skeptics. They're just going to argue with you for the sake of argument. That's okay. That happens in every field. There are still people that think the earth is flat, I'm not one of those yet. But I don't trust the government. Other questions? Thanks for asking that one, Daniel. Are any of you familiar with the blogger named Seth Godin? Let me type that in there. Seth Godin is a marketing guy. He's got a really nice haircut like I do. He's written a number of books, but as you move toward higher levels of leadership in schoolwork, I strongly advise you. You can either subscribe to his blog, and he actually I learned from him, but because my wife told me to learn from him. His daily blogs are. It's rare, extremely rare, for one of them to run over 100 words. Very tight, very pithy, but very strong thinking from an organizational perspective, and from being creative and innovative in the way that we go about our business of trying to influence friends and convert our enemies. Is that Andrew Jr.? Hi, AJ. We call him AJ.
He goes by Drew.
Okay.
He was dancing a little while ago.
Dad, stop.
I didn't hear you, Andrew. Hang on one second. Say that again.
He goes by Drew. He was dancing a little bit earlier.
Y'all have been able to hear me, haven't you? Okay. Questions? Questions if you got them. Heather, you're at church again? That's another mixed method. We got Randy's exercising and going to graduate school. Heather is worshiping and going to graduate school. Anne Marie's driving and going to graduate school. I'm just talking.
Soccer mom duty calls.
Understand. Been there, done that well. The male version. Your volume just changed and got a bit softer. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does that help? I had my audio turned down while I was talking. Not my speaker, but not my microphone, but my speaker. I've got my speaker turned off now. Okay, I'm fixing to set you free unless you got questions for me. I'll thank you all for dragging me through an interesting learning journey. We're exactly halfway through tonight, aren't we? As one of my high school coaches used to say, it's like patting for a dance. You ever heard that expression? Where you stand up against the wall at the dance and kind of tap your toe? It's just that easy. I'll see you next week.